Hi, it's a pleasure to talk with you all and share my work, however intimate our group is. So perhaps that will help with having a nice conversation afterwards. And just to confirm, you asked me to speak about 30 minutes, is that right?
Yes, this is perfect. Yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I'll be talking about the book that was mentioned and also how that book helped me think about contemporary energy politics. And I think at the core of my work is to disrupt how we think about energy. And the book, The Birth of Energy, looked at the historical emergence of the science of energy and starts with the question of what is energy anyway? It means fuel most often, of course, when it's talked about in the context of environmental and climate politics, the problem of fuel. When we think about the politics of energy, that's what we mean, fuel. And a lot of energy policy has this kind of technocratic basis. Energy is this thing that you count and you account for and you govern. But energy is also a capacious, even poetic concept. It is a word of modern science, so it underlies all understandings of change in the cosmos. It's also a popular term in New Age philosophies. It means life force, flow, change. All these meanings mix up, I think, together in popular discourse. And I was interested in this bigger cultural behemoth called energy, especially how it's understood in the West and how it became attached to fossil fuel industrialization. And then also how it became narrowed to mean fuel in politics. So in other words, this is the cover of the book, I wanted to do what Foucault would call a genealogy. I wanted to do that for energy, meaning I wanted to know how a certain understanding of energy became common sense, like a timeless thing that we just have always understood or known about. Those of you who may be familiar with STS or feminist science studies probably know Donna Haraway. And she has this great paragraph that really inspired me about how she approaches the study of biological cells. And she says that cells are historical figurations. They are real material entities, but they are also metaphor. They are inflected with our language, with social values, with connotations around the word cell, and the feelings that that word carries as it relates to boundaries and the politics of borders. So a cell is both material and metaphor, rather than either one or the other. And this is how I wanted to think about energy. And asking this simple question, where did energy as moderns know it come from, very quickly disrupted some assumptions that Americans in particular make about energy. First, although energy feels very old, timeless, prior to the 19th century, energy was a rarely used word. It comes from Aristotle, coined it, energeia. So it has these philosophical connotations. Humans were, of course, using fuel and machines and muscles prior to the 19th century when energy becomes a term of modern science in thermodynamics. But prior to this moment, these different activities were not knit together through one organized scientific knowledge. So second, the laws of thermodynamics talk about energy as a universal thing that does not change across all transformations. It is the constant, cannot be created or destroyed. So it's very universal, even cosmic. At the same time, energy appeared to me to be a fossil fueled knowledge. It was only through tinkering with steam engines and trying to make them more efficient, trying to figure out how coal powered an engine, how heat transformations work, that this notion of energy was devised. So there was something very specific about this knowledge. And finally, the more you dig into the science itself of energy, the weirder things get. It's not a settled concept, even or especially within physics. It's not a material thing like Haraway's biological cells, but rather it's a mathematical relationship. You might even think of it as an epistemology. It's useful for many closed systems, but theoretical physicists feel free to ignore some of the laws and others or flex with them. And it is also a powerful metaphor. So lest you think this is a humanities person reading the physics wrong, I wanted to share some quotes from great physicists about how weird energy is and how it is more of a mysterious epistemology rather than a hard fact or material thing that we could find out there. So first, this is a famous physicist named Richard Feynman, who taught lectures at Caltech, and he writes, it's important to realize that in physics, we have no knowledge of what energy is. We don't have a picture that energy comes in little blobs of a definite amount. There are formulas for calculating some numerical quantity, and when we add it all together, it gives the same number. And second, my favorite quotation that I found in doing this research is from a Nobel laureate named Percy Bridgman, who writes that the laws of thermodynamics have a different feel from most of the other laws of physics. There's something more palpably verbal about them. They smell more of their human origin. Why should we expect nature to be interested, either positively or negatively, in the purposes of human beings, particularly purposes of such unblushingly economic tinge? So I only have time to briefly mention what the laws of thermodynamics were. And I think given that this is a seminar about entropy, you are probably familiar with them, but I do want to stress their political effects and what this economic tinge is that Bridgman was exercised about. So let's go back to the birth of thermodynamics when energy was supposedly discovered. And this painting by J.M.W. Turner from 1844 is actually from about the same time and place that energy was born. And it's called Rain, Steam, and Speed. At this moment, steam engines had been running for decades, transforming ways of life, but they were very inefficient and no one knew exactly how heat transformations worked because no one really quite understood heat yet. It wasn't understood molecularly at the moment. I like to think that in this painting and Turner's other works of a newly industrializing country, you see the uncertainty and anxiety surrounding these changes to the landscape and ways of life. And the first scientists of energy were really motivated by the desire to make this hazy picture more ordered, to make steam engines more efficient, to get as much work as possible out of every lump of coal. And to do so, it turns out you had to get better at tracking this unruly thing called energy. And when applied to engines, it could be figured as something like this. So the first law of thermodynamics, the famous one, is that the energy of the inputs, so the fuel or the machines or the bodies, will equal the energy of the outputs, the work that is done. The form of the energy might change, but the underlying amount stays the same. And then you can track it and see how efficiently it is working. So the study of efficiency arises right along the science with the science of energy, closely connected to energy. Unfortunately for humans, and what we're interested in this seminar, there was also the second law of thermodynamics, and that is that something called entropy tends to increase. And this means that even if something called energy is conserved, it tends to dissipate into forms that cannot do work which right away creates some weird contradictions, because in a lot of engineering and even some science textbooks still, energy is defined as the capacity to do work, but entropy tells us that even though energy is conserved, it moves into forms that are less useful or less able of doing work, which seems self-contradictory. So entropy kind of throws a strange wrench into the understanding of energy, and I think is really the most important theory that comes out of thermodynamics at this time. So once a lump of coal is used for engineers who were working with these first laws, you can't have it back. If wasted, in the words of Lord Kelvin, who's one of the progenitors of the thermodynamics, the work is, quote, lost to man irrecoverably. In Northern Britain, where energy is discovered and where shipbuilding was converging with Scottish Presbyterianism and empire, these ideas about work and waste and entropy were overlain with moral and spiritual meaning from the start, what I call a geotheology of energy. This slide shows how this engine model could be applied to the governance of work more broadly, and not just the work of human bodies, but also the work of all energy flows. All activity could start to be understood in terms of energy and tracked according to how efficiently it was used or how much was wasted. And human work then can be valued according to this Western model in terms of its proximity to industrial production. So what's interesting here, I think, is that there's an awareness that the more that's pushed through a system to do work, the more waste will be produced inevitably. So it's not always, it's about avoiding waste or entropy where possible, but also about tracking it down, managing it, evacuating it, containing it. Reproduction and care activities were merely supportive, and although they also used energy, therefore they also demanded kinds of efficiency. And those activities that had no benefit to production were to be tracked down and contained as waste. So this was in sort of support of an ideology of productivism. And Anson Robbenbach, who's a historian, defines productivism as the belief that human society and nature are linked by the primacy of all productive activity, whether of laborers, machines, or natural forces. The world becomes a vast reservoir of labor power awaiting its conversion to work. The same tools then that you might use to make an engine more efficient could be used on human bodies or cities or empires. And energy is the thing that makes all of these activities comparable as work. It's what can be counted and therefore governed according to this demand for efficiency. Energy becomes a very attractive tool to serve the project of accumulation that accelerates in this moment of fossil-fueled industrial empire. And it's especially useful in the field of engineering, which is also born around this time in the 19th century and was closely aligned with capitalism. Engineers are the mine managers, the factory experts. And as I said, their energy is frequently described or defined as the ability to do work or to move matter. And power is the rate of work done. In the politics of fuel, these physical definitions are often conflated with political terms. So even decades before the science of thermodynamics, the first people who were tinkering with engines, like Matthew Boulton, who was the James, this conflation in this quote. Boulton says, "I sell here, sir, what all the world desires to have, power." And when we speak about energy, work, or power today, these terms are still haunted by thermodynamics and the practical application of them in engineering. Energy helped to lend this whole ideology of productivism, an aura of scientific authority. The universe, therefore, could seem to validate the project of putting the world to work and verifying the goodness of turning fuel into power. Even if, if that meant saying a waterfall is wasteful because its water is flowing over the edge without being put to work, for example, in a mill. There's slippage going on here between the needs of capital and the laws of nature. And I think economic tinge that Bridgman was referring to. And that's because the mathematical equations about the conservation of energy or the increase of energy don't tell us how to value energy. They don't tell us what waste is, what kinds of energy are useful, or indeed whether entropy itself is a good or bad thing. And yet energy, as defined by thermodynamics, helped to license this modern sense that there is a linear relationship between energy, work, and progress. So what that means now is that freedom from any limits imposed upon a supply of energy or a consumption of energy gets conflated with political freedom. Life with less energy or the limits on energy appears as if it would be nasty, brutish, and short, to use Hobbes' phrase. And that message still resonates because work is still understood to be central to citizenship and dignity. And by work, I mean waged work in a capitalist system. I'm starting to become more familiar with Stiegler's work recently through invitations like this to speak seminars that are inspired by his work. So I understand there could be different ways of reimagining work. And I think my own research is really in conversation with that. But the way we currently understand work as waged labor is still understood to be central to citizenship. And even many on the left have learned to translate their demands in the language of work and the expansion of a right to work, which I think is still often built upon this productivist relationship to the earth itself. So a through line of my book is that this nexus of energy, work, and freedom remains dominant in how the West values and relates to energy today. And most crucially, I think that means all kinds of energy, whether it's fossil fuels or potentially solar or wind. So now I want to turn to thinking about contemporary discussions about energy transition or the politics of energy, and particularly in the US. One story about energy that the fossil fuel promoters repeat over and over again in defense of fossil fuels is a story about jobs. So that climate action will kill jobs. And you can see that in this tweet from the American Petroleum Institute. And also John Barrasso, who's a Republican senator. But Biden too, President Biden, a Democrat, has taken up this debate about jobs. And it's hard to underestimate the centrality of jobs to both the defense of fossil fuels, but also to mainstream discussions about energy futures. So, for example, Biden said today's climate day at the White House, which means it's jobs day at the White House. And the climate legislation, when it was proposed in the US, became called the American Jobs Plan. So, of course, this is a bit of political theater, and it's counting upon this appeal of jobs to carry sweeping legislation through Congress. But it's that very appeal, the assumption of a connection between work, freedom, and energy, that I think is part of the ecological problem. And in some former fossil fuel regions of the US, like Appalachia, which is where I currently live, a former coal region, or Texas, where I have many family, fossil fuels have become symbols, conservative symbols, sometimes rather than direct employers or material interests for many people who live there. So there is a small fossil fuel elite that stands to lose trillions of dollars, and capitalism itself will be challenged without easy access to fossil fuels. But I think it's important to recognize broader public attachments to fossil fuels beyond this elite. Coal and oil can do more than ensure profit or jobs. They also secure cultural meaning and political subjectivities that are really rooted in this kind of mass consumerism and productivism. So that's why I want to emphasize that energy transition is not as simple as switching types of fuel, because the West might be able to switch fuels while holding onto this bigger attachment to energy as putting the world to work. So energy transitions have to be about how work is organized and also about desire. So for some, ending fossil fuels can be experienced as an identity and cultural challenge, and one that some feel should be resisted even violently and through authoritarianism. And in my thinking about energy politics today, I've been interested in how gender identities feature into this nexus of work and freedom. Feminist science studies and also feminist critiques of work were really important to me in thinking about energy in my book historically. And so I brought some of that focus into thinking about attachments to energy, looking at how energy desires are entangled with hegemonic masculinity in the US, which I termed petromasculinity. And here I'm relating the defense of fossil fuels to hypermasculinity and the defense of a kind of patriarchal order. And also this urge, this turn towards authoritarianism. Petromasculinity describes how unbounded energy consumption can become a performance of spectacular power in a world that is seen increasingly as a threat to that power, to that order. So it's kind of an anxious reaction. In studying this, I was interested in how the threat of climate change and the threat to fossil fuel systems and the threat posed by Black Lives Matter or feminism, the threat to white patriarchal rule, could become interwoven emotionally and affectively, helping to feed authoritarian desires. And this is very different than the expectation that as people learn more about climate science or experience climate disasters, there will be this kind of natural turn towards the desire for climate action. The fossil fuel PR machine really builds on this and on a petro-nostalgia amplified by Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," this fantasy of a mid-20th century life when white men ruled suburban households. And it's no coincidence that studies have shown that white conservative men, regardless of class in America, appear to be among the most vociferous obstructors of climate mitigation. The achievement of this fantasy ideal was predicated upon the ongoing supply of fossil fuels. And I think we're all familiar with the story, how cars, suburbs, highways, the division of public and private space were all bound up with the acceleration of fossil fuels in the US in this 20th century period. So this infrastructure helped to create and connect the desires of some Americans to the never-ending supply of fossil energy that made that dream possible, and that also infected how people thought about freedom and work and the economy itself. The explosive power of combustion then could be equated with an expression of virility and with freedom, when freedom means the ability to do what you like with your property, to burn, to expand, to produce. And so when the Trump administration had their energy policy and they called it energy domination, that was their policy, it was like so much of Trump's administration. It wasn't really a brand new policy. It was just an unabashed declaration or revealing admission of what had been going on along with US imperialism. But it's important to see that these work and freedom stories that are tied to oil and gas can also and are also being mapped onto wind and solar projects, especially dominant kind of big Western state-led projects, and other so-called green technologies, or putting all of our faith into technocratic solutions. So here are just two of the most egregious examples. The Tesla Cybertruck, which is designed to look like a military vehicle, and the Hummer, which ensures domination of the earth off-road. And even beyond trucks, which have always been tightly connected to American masculinity, these stories appear in how solar and wind power are marketed to the public. There's a masculinized dream of independence, of technology that will finally free us from nature, free us from household labor, free us from the demands of, for example, global South miners. And that could be clean, free, untainted by these demands from others. This promised stability of an American way of life, the stability of mass consumerism, one that could cut any sense of dependency on the earth or on others. And this is very much a fantasy, but the underbelly of the fantasy then is that when environmentalists or policymakers call to recognize ecological dependency or global dependencies of the American way of life, it feels like an affront to freedom. It feels like something that must be done then as a sacrifice, as something given up, rather than working along the lines of desire. And this might be the most insidious problem with these energy stories. When they are accepted as the ground upon which we struggle over fuel, environmentalists get sorted into two camps. There are those who promise to keep and sustain the American way of life. And these are often called the eco-modernists. And those then who are asking that we give things up, that we must discipline desire. And I think it's exciting to look at, for example, the degrowth community and other global South movements as examples trying to find a ground in between that, where it's not about either sustaining a way of life or disciplining desire. By being aware of these stories as troubling cultural constructs rather than as natural fact, we can disrupt them rather than operate within their frameworks. And I think that's why work and especially feminist approaches to work focusing on care and dependency are so important to me in terms of reorganizing how energy is valued and related to. And that's also where the importance of desire comes in. It's important to refuse fossil fuel PR because it's already decided in advance what's desirable. Jobs and the fantasy of independence, and that we always need more of both. These dreams are vulnerable to disruption because they have failed to deliver well-being to most people on Earth certainly, but even in the US, where high and very intensive energy consumption is not distributed equally and does not generate well-being for most people. But we should hesitate before attacking these stories primarily through tropes of guilt and discipline, very sort of Anglo-Protestant tropes. That would be to accept that freedom must mean independence. Freedom might also mean a kind of sufficiency achieved through healthier relations of dependency that are mutual rather than extractive. And I think the catch is that there needs to be a material and infrastructural transformation of land and labor and money in order for such a freedom, a different kind of freedom to function. So it's kind of like we need the desire for that shift, but we also need that shift to help produce or show the possibility of these different kinds of desires and understandings of freedom. And this would not just be a matter of justice, of paying back what is owed to others and to the earth. It's also a matter of building new worlds in which dependency could be fulfilling rather than exhausting, as it is now for so many. that kind of freedom would be filled with obligations, but also liberated from this anxiety that drives the constant need to grow, to produce, to work until exhaustion sets in. I'll stop there. Thank you.